Before anyone gets the wrong end of the stick, I'm going to start this video by making one thing clear from the outset. This is not an attack against the purported individuals in question or their previously established reputation. I've noticed a lot of people have already publicly commented against the person known as Francis Bourgeois, questioning his car knowledge owing to the manner in which he became famous and his overabundant enthusiasm towards public transport. Before I'd done my research, I felt very much the same way. What does a guy who's only ever made videos about trains know about cars? But the fact is, if you can land a video with Chris Harris of all people, there has to be something special in that mind of yours pertaining to cars that just hasn't yet been tapped into all that much. As a result, most of this video is going to serve as a recap as to why the Grand Tour exists in the first place, alongside a reprise of the video I released in March concerning Jeremy Clarkson's for car. Although I'd personally never heard of Throttle House prior to the week I wrote this script, it appears they are wildly popular on YouTube and clearly possess a great deal of automotive knowledge, given that they've made a video on John Dodd's Beast, for instance. For that video alone, their expertise is not in doubt. Truth be told, these look very much like the sort of people the BBC should have chosen to accompany Chris Harris in helming Top Gear after its late 2010s period of woe, as opposed to two over-the-hill blokes from the world of light entertainment. And if Amazon has indeed poached them from underneath the noses of terrestrial television, then personally I'm overjoyed for them. That's 3 less careers for the BBC to waste. 3 less careers for Tim Davie and the spectre of Tony Hall's influence to put through the ringer. But what I am not happy with, and certainly take umbrage over, are the rumours circulating the name in which these 3 are slated to create their productions under, where rather than just using the pre-existing Throttle House moniker or something new, they are being instead earmarked to continue the Grand Tour. The same Grand Tour which ran for 8 years and itself was a continuation of Jeremy Clarkson era Top Gear, along with his cohorts James May, Richard Hammond, Andy Willman and about half of the production crew. Personally, if this is true, I strongly oppose Amazon's proposal for reasons I'll delve into over the duration of this video. Although there has not yet been any official statement from Amazon themselves, or indeed any of the Grand Tour's key personalities outside of what Richard Hammond said last year, these renewed rumours have since been corroborated by the likes of the Radio Times, London Evening Standard, and The Independent, among several other publications. As a result, I now feel that these rumours, first originated by The Sun, are now substantiated enough at this point to be taken with more than just a cursory grain of salt, given that no one has yet disproved them, and I wish to be among the first online personalities to report on them. If these rumours turn out to be untrue, which I sincerely hope they are, then I will happily recuse myself. But I am choosing to make this video under the informed pretense as given by several large media outlets in the week prior to them making this video. I feel Amazon are in the process of making a terrible mistake and would like to attempt an appeal to discourage them from making such a mistake before it happens. Over the next half hour, I'm going to try and explain why exploiting the Grand Tour intellectual property in this manner is not something that should happen and will only help to jeopardise the otherwise promising careers of its 3 alleged hosts. I will begin by talking about how the Grand Tour came to be in the first place and what it means to someone like me. I would also like to use this part of the video to give you a look around at what is basically the Gear Knob studio. It is probably very different from how you might have imagined it. No LEDs, no soundproofing, a used Chinese microphone I paid £15 for in 2022, and some thin beige walls that were built in the 70s. The backdrop is literally just a wall, a 3D printer I've never found the time to use, some posters which have been up since I was a young teenager, a stick helmet I've crudely believed tacked to the wall, and as you'll see in the next couple of minutes, a hairline that has been gradually heading south for the past 5 years. With that said, it's time to set the scene. We find ourselves once more in the early spring of 2015. BBC's Top Gear, at the height of its power and popularity despite being 13 years old at this point, was now quickly unravelling at the seams due to the burnout and psychological fatigue suffered by its eminent lead presenter, Jeremy Clarkson. These problems would reach a critical mass 48 hours following a false cancer diagnosis on the evening of Series 22 Episode 7's studio session. Having thoroughly sloshed himself on rosé, the inebriated Clarkson would then decide to assault Oshin Tiemann upon their delayed return at the Symonston Hall, kick-starting a long chain of events that ended with the BBC gleefully seizing the Top Gear IP for itself once and for all, under the mistaken assumption that everything would continue the way it was, barring Clarkson, the latter instead being made to fend for himself. This of course didn't happen because in the real world there are concepts such as loyalty and basic common sense. Point being, if the BBC could easily rid itself of one problematic personality over a single incident, regardless of their popularity of how much they contributed to the company's coffers, then it stood to reason that they could get rid of anyone else at any time. And indeed, that's exactly what ended up happening. If you're a smart frog, You don't keep giving piggyback rides to scorpions after watching one of your compadres drown because of one. You jump out of that particular lake and get away from them. For those who weren't previously aware, back in March I released a 2-hour-long documentary covering Clarkson's infamous fracas and the year of events leading up to it, which has since garnered over 500,000 views and counting, albeit with a bit more backlash than any previous video I've made, with a current like-to-dislike ratio of 91%. Some of this I chalk down to my increasingly publicised disdain with certain online creators who I feel use their popularity to do nothing but mock and belittle my hobby and the culture it represents. And I do not yet concern myself with any of those individuals until those respective videos are ready to come out. What I do concern myself with are the people who feel that for whatever reason the BBC were in the right to do what they did. Now of course the BBC had every right to do whatever they did. After all, they were the ones who now own Top Gear, having purchased the remainder of Better 6 in the September of 2012. The problem wasn't so much a large corporation like the BBC being allowed to do whatever they wanted, but rather questioning whether or not they should have. At the point of the fracas, Top Gear were on the verge of a major resurgence after such an awkward middle age that had been punctuated by controversy after controversy. The programme had, at no doubt great expense, secured a worldwide simulcasting deal which meant it would be shown in over 200 countries at exactly the same time, a privilege that very few series got to enjoy. They promised a 10-week barrage of content throughout the entire first quarter of 2015, preceded by the Red Button special An Evening with Top Gear, as well as the 2-part Patagonia special in late December. Beginning from February, they would then commence one of their biggest world tours in years, with stops in Norway, Poland, Barbados, South Africa and Australia. Top Gear was guaranteed to make 2015 one of their most successful years from a financial perspective, so long as the BBC left well enough alone and allowed the team enough room to breathe. That was all they needed to do. But as we learned from 2014, the BBC was seemingly unable to keep stum. Without someone suitably mature and level-headed like Mark Thompson in charge of the BBC, a person who was willing to go to bat for the programme in the face of thousands of complaints up to and including speaking at the House of Commons in Jeremy Clarkson's defence, things rather quickly ended up going to the dogs. They entertained lone complaints from individuals who weren't even British citizens in some cases, who wished to run riot over the programme. It was these complaints which then caused the BBC to grossly overreact for their alleged health check. It was really just a way for them to invasively disrupt Top Gear's production and seriously jeopardise the programme by potentially cancelling him outright based purely on the merits of a year-old outtake leaked by The Mirror, which had been subsequently publicised through a Nosy Nancy's lawfare campaign. Fortunately, the programme wouldn't be cancelled yet, but because again, it's utterly insane to fire someone for actions that never went or were never intended to go to air, but boy, did Danny Cohen try. A lot of people commented on that aforementioned video who believed the BBC acted reasonably in spite of my best attempts to articulate my points as succinctly as possible. Points such as if you are ever put in charge of a TV station and are not willing to speak to your highest paid on-screen personality about their troubling personal issues, and quite frankly you are too emotionally immature and incapable of running a TV station. The only reasonable decision you should then be able to make at that point is to step down and give your seat to someone who knows what they're doing, before you wreak irreparable damage on a channel you were truthfully never fit to run. Doubly so if you have a pre-existing personal vendetta clouding your own impartial judgment. I also don't think it's that controversial to laugh when bad things happen to bad people like Tony Hall. Again, if you feel Hall was a righteous individual who stood up for the likes of Oshin Tiemann, then please do read up about Martin Bashir's Princess Diana interview and the lengths Hall went to in order to protect his golden boy, helping to ruin the life and career of Matt Wiesler in the process. A man whose only crime was to make a prop bank statement without being truthfully told what it was for. How Hall's career at the BBC ultimately ended was perhaps a little unfair, but it was inarguably just. You cannot build an entire career out of stabbing people in the back, all the way up to the ladder of the fabled position of BBC Director General, and not have it bite you in the arse 25 years down the line. At some point, you have to pay the piper, and Hall's price was very steep indeed. Then there were the people who believed I felt Clarkson should not have been punished owing to the compassionate grounds I cited, chiefly the lasting emotional damage caused by the death of his mother, his own near-death experiences in Argentina, and the life-altering worries brought about by his false cancer diagnosis. Of course, no extenuating circumstances in the world should be enough to excuse you socking someone in the face, but that in itself is not the problem. The real problem is that most of what has been historically talked about the night of the 4th of March 2015 is shrouded in mystery and based purely on conjecture, witnessed by hotel staff who weren't involved directly, and the findings of Ken McQuarrie's report. A report from a man who was effectively Tony Hall's underling, given that he helped to fire Hall's predecessor George Entwistle in the wake of the 2012 McAlpine scandal. To this day, there remains no audio or video recordings of the incident which took place that night, meaning that what might have been publicised as a furious torrent of abuse and fisticuffs could very well have just been a load of slurred rambling and some uncoordinated staggering about the hotel floor, with Clarkson landing a lucky hit that ended up sealing his fate. In fact, that's probably what it was. This is reinforced by the fact that although the North Yorkshire Constabulary involved themselves with the investigation, they ultimately took no further action. If that was the case, what happened that night couldn't have been that earth-shatteringly horrific. Without a smidgen of physical evidence that Clarkson was in an uncompromised mental state and genuinely consumed with a burning hatred of Oshin Tiemann, it's arrogant to assume what he did that night was an exercise in egotism, of Clarkson punching down on someone who could not adequately defend himself purely because he could. That goes up to and including the comments made by Richard Porter in his book, which were written by someone who wasn't even there that night. Clarkson's message to the media in the immediate hours following his suspension from the BBC was therefore loud, clear and unambiguous.
I wish people would leave Osh alone, because none of this is his fault.
Furthermore, with Alan Yentop's sad passing in the weeks following the video's upload, Clarkson revealed a small nugget of information regarding that night via Twitter. That Yentop had been the one to call for Clarkson's firing, but he knew what had really gone on. This is significant because it was Yentop's ultimatum towards the BBC in 1986 regarding the future of Top Gear that resulted in Clarkson's appointment to the programme a year later. Now, I might be looking a little too far into things, but it sounds to me that critical information was being purposefully withheld from Yentop, who at the time was the BBC's creative director and no doubt one of the most influential voices from within the company. My question is as follows. What did Alan Yentop really know? Was it merely a case of Yentop and Clarkson speaking on the phone after the controversy was brought to light, the latter merely clarifying what he had done? Or was Yentop perhaps aware of a plot from within the BBC to oust Clarkson, with the fracas serving as the ultimate scapegoat? In light of any conspiracy theories, there were many ways the BBC could have then sanctioned Clarkson without firing him. Dog his pay, issue him with a hefty fine, force him into a televised apology, including opening a future episode of Top Gear with Tiemann as the focus, subject him to an anger management course, anything to avoid creating a martyr in the manner in which they did. Because as harsh as this may sound, Clarkson and his two co-presenters were simply far too much valuable of an asset for the BBC to cast aside over a single scrap. And they should have realised this. If the only viable solution to a problem of this magnitude is to consciously sabotage your own future potential success in the name of making a statement, then that unfortunately explains a lot about the modern world we live in today. A world where we'd rather kill the goose that lays the golden eggs because it bit someone, instead of first trying to understand why it bit someone. The fact that the Grand Tour even happened disproved all of its doubters in the first 3 years of its existence, and made the team a ton of money, unequivocally proved that not only were the BBC objectively wrong to sack Clarkson and allow such a visionary creative force to leave for the realm of online TV, but there was also something clearly wrong with the working environment at the BBC to allow things to get to such a bad state in the weeks and months leading up to the infamous fracas, given that nothing of a similar nature has ever been known to have transpired during their tenure under Jeff Bezos. And as all that was going on, the BBC could only sit in the shadow of the three personalities they had chosen to let go and pray that constant mudslinging against their former employees and enough positive PR from the right media outlets would be enough to alter the layman's perception of what they chose to call Top Gear. But it wasn't enough in the end. After repeated warning signs that 2/3 of the team they had hired were not skilled enough at driving to do what they did on a regular basis, and a clear lack in the safety department, the worst came to pass. Thankfully, Freddie Flintoff was able to walk his injuries off for the most part, but the scars will remain with him for the rest of his life, and it killed the final hope of Top Gear being able to recover after the loss of Clarkson. For 6 years it had flopped around, a directionless husk under 3 different presenting teams, and by the end of 2022 it was mercifully down for the count. You can disagree all you want, but to me it is undeniable at this point, in the fallout of the fracas, the BBC failed. Catastrophically. They chose to pursue moral grandstanding over taking a step back, trying their hardest to ameliorate such a bad situation until there was no hope left, and if everything worked itself out, putting the gravy train back on the rails. But what they foolishly decided was that the Top Gear name itself was what was making them the money, not the inimitable chemistry and loyalty between its three main personalities, and therefore decided to carry on the show without any of them. All those memorable moments from the Grand Tour, all those viewing figures, all that successful marketing that Amazon were able to capitalise on should have by right been the BBC's to enjoy. But they lacked a Director General who actually listened to the concerns of their on-screen talent and took steps to appropriately address them. And they lacked a channel controller who wasn't a vindictive little goblin out for blood. With those two people switched out and replaced with more competent folk from the off, who knows where Top Gear could have gone? There would have been no such thing as Clarkson's final warning. When they were ambushed in Argentina, they would have done just that little bit more to protect the sanctity of the programme and seek prosecution for those who were involved in any riotous behaviour. When Lawrence Davies' sad little firm made repetitive and libellous accusations that an hour of Jeremy Clarkson was the equivalent to listening to a far-right speech, the BBC should have gone out of their way to defend the programme, guns blazing, against such utter nonsense. All the rubbish which came out the mouths of Lawrence, Somi de Souza, and anyone else who clamoured around the venerable name of Top Gear in the hunt for clout and contrarianism should have all been decisively shot down in a court of law. Or at the very least, it shouldn't have been allowed to quietly fester to the point it then actively influenced the BBC's policy towards Top Gear. Don't get me wrong, people have a right to dislike what they want. Not everyone has to like Top Gear. But when they start spreading outright lies, untruths, and making hysterical and baseless claims because they dislike Top Gear, that's different. That's when it becomes a problem. That's when it starts to damage not only the reputation of the programme, but its profit streams as well. And above all else, people tend to forget the fact that large media corporations, even those ran by the government like the BBC, primarily exist to make money. That is their foremost goal, more so than entertaining the masses or running as tight a ship as possible. Were that not the case, then the TV license would have ceased to exist many years ago, and they wouldn't have cried as hard as they did over being stripped of US aid funding, portraying themselves as the victims once American taxpayer money was rightfully taken from them. And yet they didn't seem to care all that much when an enterprise from which they were legitimately making money from was at constant threat of cancellation because of a ceaseless crusade against it. Top Gear in its prime was making the BBC an unfathomable amount of money every single year. We're talking low 9 digits in a bad year. Jeremy Clarkson and Andy Willman were the principal architects in getting the BBC that money, which is why they did 15 episodes of Top Gear along with a feature-length special every year, which would then be reshown in 200 countries worldwide. Which is why they did 50 live shows all around the world every year. Which is why they helped put out 13 magazines a year and at least a couple books alongside an annual home video exclusive. All of these combined netted the BBC a ridiculous amount of money, and they would have continued to make that money if they just stayed in their lane and stopped antagonising the programme's dedicated inner circle. But because the BBC did not share the same vision as the majority of Top Gear's team retreated to the hills and left the public eye for 3 months as they searched high and low looking for a brand new circus to attach themselves to. That is where the Grand Tour comes in. In July 2015, that circus would turn out to be Amazon, whose fledgling Prime streaming platform gave the team an offer they could not refuse. Going with Amazon or a similar rival was an absolute necessity at this point, because among various stipulations in their existing BBC contracts, they were forced to obey a non-compete clause, which meant that the team could not sign with any other British TV network until the spring of 2017. And even if they chose to sign with an online broadcaster like Amazon, they still had to obey some ridiculous technicalities to make sure what they made wasn't too similar to Top Gear. But the infamy generated in the wake of Clarkson's fracas meant that the trio were now white hot, and they could not waste that potential. They would begin filming in the autumn of 2015 and premiere a little over a year later, following a launch festival in the Mojave Desert. The Grand Tour would prove to be a hit from the get-go, becoming the most pirated TV show on Earth, beating an unofficial record set by its own predecessor. Critical reception towards the programme was unfortunately so-so for its first couple years, owing to the limitless budget the team had been presented with and scriptwriters who had clearly lost their passion over time, cranking out episodes that were basically expensive middle fingers to the audience who accused them of calling out the programme as scripted. By the third series, however, once they chucked off all the dead weight and regrouped, they were able to nail things down once again. There was no longer any doubt that Top Gear had found itself a worthy successor to end the story with, and what a glorious ending it was. And that's the whole point. the show ended, as every other show eventually does. It waltzed off into the sunset. Here were three men who had nothing left to prove and in truth hadn't for the better part of a decade, but were still making new content purely out of love for the game and the fans alike. All three of them could have used the events of March 2015 as the opportunity to retire from the public eye altogether, but that wasn't what they chose to do. They chose to keep working at 110% well into their 50s and kept going for some years after that. They have brought so much entertainment to all the people around the world that it would take an average person months, if not years, to fully digest it all. If all the work that Clarkson, Hammond and May produced for us over the years were one big car-shaped pyramid, and the Grand Tour, more specifically One for the Road, would be its capstone. The completion of a life's work. There does not need to be anything else beyond this point, certainly not something for three aspirational youngsters seeking to carry the name on for God knows what reason. I just don't understand why Amazon are doing this. I mean, I do understand why Amazon are doing this, but I just don't understand why they think this could possibly be a good idea. I think they're setting these three young presenters up for nothing more than failure, and something that has the potential to tarnish their careers in the long run should this project bomb. After all, that's how Chris Harris's television career died. Since the end of Top Gear in 2022, all he's done is make a single appearance on Joe Rogan, where he talked a load of crap about the 2008 Top Gear Tesla Roadster incident, where, should we remind ourselves, a very egocentric man caught not one but two big L's in the courtroom, all while bragging that his version of Top Gear was comparatively scandal-free, lest we mention the name Jared Shelby. He has also made one appearance on a version of The Weakest Link not hosted by Anne Robinson, and 3 appearances in what I assume is the BBC's way of compensating Harris and former Top Gear co-presenter Paddy McGuinness after the rest of what would have been the budget for Top Gear's 4 millionth series ended up as part of Freddie Flintoff's injury settlement. And unless his career magically gets a second wind under someone who knows what they're doing, what the BBC did to Chris Harris was tantamount to what the pro wrestling industry referred to as a burial. They gave him 60-odd episodes of Top Gear, of which only half he had any apparent degree of creative control over, and for quite a few of those he was basically depicted as a loser. For as humiliating as some of the situations the old trio found themselves in, none of them, not even Richard Hammond, were ever made to look like a complete dweeb. Now compare that against Chris Harris being manhandled and having a watermelon chucked onto his head. The only automotively minded person on screen, and he's got chunks of melon streaming down his face. What sort of message do you think that sends to the younger Top Gear fan? Granted, the old trio did have the old occasional play fight, but that was all in good nature. Whether you preferred Clarkson, Hammond or May, all 3 were equally worthy role models for those growing up in the 2000s and early 2010s to aspire to, and none of them were ever made to look worse than the other for the sake of cheap comic relief and forced chemistry. They proved that it was still cool to love cars, and that doing so didn't make you look like a male horse girl, as certain histrionic online commenters would so otherwise proudly proclaim. With this in mind, it stands to reason that a series like the Grand Tour deserves to be protected by its showrunners and property holders alike, without diluting it with 6 or more years of wishy-washy nonsense that no one really asked for and no one really cares is now gone from the airwaves once and for all. Yet that seems to be what they're gearing up to do and have been for quite a while if prior headlines are any indication. As I stated from the outset, this is not an attack against any of the 3 personalities that Amazon have allegedly chosen for this new Grand Tour. Like I said at the start, although the petrolhead credentials of someone who got famous by filming train TikToks with a fisheye lens are certainly more than enough grounds to be brought into serious question, you wouldn't be called upon by Chris Harris to present a film together. Because of this, I know that what this team is going to be able to put together, provided creative meddling doesn't rear its ugly head, is going to be of an assuredly high quality. Whether they will last upwards of 20 years in each other's company will remain to be seen. But the way they seem to be going about it is all wrong. Early speculation seems to indicate that if the intended plans do go ahead, viewership will drop to under 1.5 million per episode, and if that happens, it's unlikely it'll be renewed. I think the main reason Amazon are doing this is because they mistakenly believe the Grand Tour IP holds some residual value in it. For Top Gear, this was certainly true. That's why it was taken all over the world and given various local makeovers. Top Gear was the biggest name in all of automotive journalism for a very long time, and using it automatically bestowed that new program a layer of prestige it otherwise wouldn't have had. This came after decades of existence and rapid growth ushered in for its Clarkson Helm 2002 revival. But even so, Top Gear was already a very established name abroad as far back as the mid-1990s. People knew what Top Gear was long before it exploded in popularity throughout the 2000s. But the same can't be said for the Grand Tour, and here's why. The Grand Tour is effectively a surrogate IP. Its entire purpose was to serve as a means to end the Holy Trinity's automotive broadcasting career after the BBC failed them, and they could no longer use the Top Gear name. Even its initials, TGT, have as much of a claim to stand for Top Gear 2 as they did the Grand Tour. For all intents and purposes, the Grand Tour's intellectual property does not extend beyond a show, 2 books, both of which I own copies of, a video game, and whatever remains of Drive Tribe as of 2025, including a live show I may or may not be attending in August. Unlike Top Gear, there was no stage show, no accompanying magazine, no DVD home videos, and certainly no foreign adaptations. It is a purely standalone media production that exists only because they obviously couldn't call it Top Gear. And for anything else to call itself the Grand Tour, after all, that is just wrong. It was a Grand Tour our beloved TV heroes embarked on for one last ride, all around the world. There was nary an inch of the globe the team didn't descend on during their 8-year journey, from the darkest steppes of Africa to the ginormous jungles of South America, the sweeping steppes of Caucasia, or the ravenous, relentless rapids of the Mekong Delta. There was a deep personal connection between us, the audience, and the free hosts from day one. Because unlike Top Gear, we knew the Grand Tour's days were numbered before it even started, as it was to be comprised of 3 series, airing over 3 years, with bi-yearly specials for an indefinite number of years thereafter, and that we were to enjoy and savour every last one of them before the curtains drew to a final close. With this new team, there will be no such sense of scarcity. If they really wanted to, they could choose to crank out 2 series a year of 10 episodes apiece for as long as their hearts desired, or gave out for. It wouldn't be a single final Grand Tour of the world as the 2016 incarnation of the programme set out to achieve, but the first of potentially many. Now, if these 3 young presenters were American or resided in America, the decision Amazon could have made should be rather obvious. They call this new show Grand Tour USA. That's perfectly fine. It links to the original IP without outrightly pretending that it's the parent show. In that vein, if you consider the original Grand Tour as a global show, and you could call this new show Grand Tour UK, but that's a bit clumsy since the Holy Trinity was still British themselves. That likewise averts disaster using the Grand Tour name if they absolutely must, and there is no other option available to them. The Grand Tour as a singular entity is and should always remain tied to the 3 former Top Gear presenters. Part of the reason as to why Top Gear failed so badly after 2015 is because it was such an open betrayal of the programme's worldwide fan base. The BBC had given themselves the opportunity to create a brand new Top Gear from a blank canvas, but instead they merely chose to follow in their footsteps of a product that could just never match the original, let alone improve upon it. So many elements were retained that it was never even given a chance to develop its own identity. Years after their departure, the majority of people continue to hold a strong public association of the programme with Clarkson and not so much his replacements. Even though a team which Chris Harris formed a part of lasted for 12 series, more than a third of the show's total run, it was never really a part of Top Gear in the same way that even Sabina Schmitz was. He was just sort of anonymously there for 60 episodes, overseeing 3 separate regime changes, but never truly took charge. And to me, this is exactly what Amazon seem intent in doing with the Grand Tour, provided the rumours are true. People aren't going to give the show they make a fair shot, not only because of the fact it will have the Grand Tour name attached to it, but also because of a lingering bad taste in their mouths over how the BBC already tried and failed to keep the Top Gear name relevant. And unlike the media's insistence that Top Gear was more than just Clarkson, the Grand Tour was only ever just Clarkson. This will make any attempt at continuing the show's legacy beyond One for the Road look even more contrived than late-stage Top Gear did. Truthfully, I wish this prospective team the best, whether or not they decide to go ahead with their original plans. Again, it's extremely important that the up-and-coming generations of petrolheads have their own idols to look up to who aren't just racing drivers, especially with the car industry in such a shambles as it is. But I do not believe this is the way they should go about their claim to fame, by riding the coattails of 3 legendary TV personalities and an esteemed IP they helped to build in the wake of Top Gear's collapse. I think this is nothing more than Amazon's shameless attempt to capitalise on the void left by Top Gear's 2022 cancellation, and this production will likely suffer the same mistakes that the BBC's attempts did. If these three personalities have signed to Amazon for a TV deal, then they should do so under either the Throttle House moniker or a new IP entirely. If they truly believe in the strength of their production and their ability to present a compelling TV program, then there is absolutely no reason as to why this show can't just be called Throttle House TV. A team like that is already successful and should not need the name of someone else's work in order to bolster their own. As they say, if you build it, they will come. If Throttle House are as good as many say they are, they will frankly not need the illustrious Grand Tour name to draw up interest in their work. Their efforts will speak for themselves. If Amazon truly respects itself and the hard work its creators have brought for them over the years, then they should leave the Grand Tour intellectual property alone. It should stand tall as one of Amazon's finest creations and a triumph for streaming platforms worldwide over traditional TV. If it wants to launch a new car show with the Throttle House duo and Francis Bourgeois, then they should trust that these three can deliver a competent product, one that could define the car culture of the 2030s and beyond, but it doesn't need to use the Grand Tour name as a crutch. Because for such ardent fans of the show they once fronted, the Grand Tour helped to give closure to the 3.5 men who defined so many years of our lives. I think I'm right in saying that no presenting team on Earth stayed together as long as the core Top Gear quartet. Monty Python only lasted 20 years before Gray and Chapman's sad demise, and other than a single movie and live tour of the Americas, it's not like they were ever doing all that much after 1979 anyway. The Top Gear team spent 21 years together, the number of months depending on whether or not you include the first series, and throughout that duration they did not go a single year without putting together at least 90 minutes of top quality material. They could have left or split up many years prior, and yet they didn't. They continued working well into what should have been their retirement, an otherwise inevitable downward spiral into working for an irrelevant digital publication or TV show like so many of their cohorts did. And yet they didn't, because we loved them too much to allow such an undignified fate to befall them. A new Grand Tour could work, but as we've seen with Top Gear, it could end up completely diminishing not only the legacy of the program's presently concluded incarnation, but also the career growth of free online entertainers who have the charisma to make the most of their time in the spotlight. In 30 years' time, there could be someone like me out there who will look up to these people in the same way I look up to the Holy Trinity today. If Amazon are to use the Grand Tour name as opposed to something new, then they are unnecessarily risking their chances by giving their production a name that will only represent the act of stolen valor. And if the fans were to reject it, then their wider reputation will be tarnished with a stink that will be extremely difficult to wash and clean off, and at worst could prematurely end their careers before they even had the chance to begin. Just ask Chris Evans. He only ever starred in 6 episodes of Top Gear, but because he constantly made a complete tit of himself, viciously defending his tenure to the last, all the while continually stabbing the program's long-term fans in the back, the people haven't forgotten him that easily, nor will they likely ever forgive him. His TV career died in flames, and deservedly so. In the end, reviving the Grand Tour name isn't just a creative gamble on behalf of Amazon, it's a reputational one. For a new generation of presenters with genuine talent and promise, stepping into the shoes of icons under the same banner risks them inviting all sorts of unfair comparisons and unrelenting scrutiny. If Amazon has faith in these people to present a show that will join the ranks of its most esteemed productions, then it needs to give them room to grow and, critically, a brand to build their legacies with, without carrying the baggage of the past. Legacies should be honoured, not exploited, because once a TV network breaks its trust with viewers, as history is shown with the likes of the BBC for instance, the fallout can be devastating. Outside of building up its pre-existing intellectual property, there is no valid reason whatsoever for Amazon to take the Grand Tour name and genericize it in order to represent their perennial car show, because doing so forces unneeded amounts of pressure for its 3 young hopefuls to fill what are likely the 3 biggest pairs of shoes throughout the history of automotive journalism. Amazon need to do what the BBC did 23 years ago and give them a stress-free environment to develop for a few years, giving them the time they crucially need to build their chemistry in a way the Chris Harris years of Top Gear were never allowed to. Before I go, I would like to draw attention to the fact that I am now uploading once again on my second channel for my non-Top Gear related uploads. If you're interested in subscribing to that channel in order to hear my thoughts on various topics outside of Top Gear, it costs nothing and I would very much appreciate it if you did. As you might have expected at this point, my video plans for the month got derailed by this news I chose to address, as well as more obligatory rewrites for the script presently in production. Nothing is cancelled as of yet, and I once more applaud everyone else's patience. Above all else, I'd like to thank you all for watching this video. This wasn't an easy decision for me to make, but I figured I had to get this video out as soon as possible. I hope it wasn't too awkward. I might be attending, as I said, I might be attending the Drive Tribe live event in August, so I figured this would give you a chance to see what I look like in the flesh, in case any of you wanted to meet me or whatever. I hope you did enjoy this video. It's a little different from what I've made in the past, even I'll admit that. Now, I'm still working on all my existing projects, don't think for a second I've stopped them. And above all else, I'd like to thank you all for your continued support. I do hope to see you all in the next video. Do take care.